Tyrant's Realm is a roguelike game that's essentially a hybrid of Dead Cells and Elden Ring. But in reality, it turns out to be a roguelite Souls-like. And my immediate thoughts on this game is it is an insanely fun game to actually play, but the game is incredibly flawed in a couple of ways that it's very hard to see past, especially as someone who's a fan of both Elden Ring and Dead Cells. Basically, I feel like the game took what was the key element of each game, but doesn't necessarily understand why they both actually work. I don't want to say it's like copying the homework, but it's basically copying the homework but not understanding why it was done in such a way.
What exactly is Tyrant's Realm?
Tyrant's Realm is a roguelike game that's inspired by the PS1 era and the Souls-like genre. So your basic combat is going to be very similar to a game like Elden Ring, and from that perspective, it controls and plays pretty well. I'm not gonna say I'm the biggest Souls-like enthusiast in the world. I mean, I'm desperately waiting here for Nightreign to come out, and I've played a bit of Elden Ring, but I'm not that great at it. But just when you compare the way these two games feel, Tyrant's Realm doesn't feel as nice to play. And look, let's be fair. We're comparing a small indie game versus a multi-million dollar game. Sometimes it's a little unfair to draw comparisons at that caliber. But in a game like this, controls mean everything.
But let's take a second to see how the game controls.
I don't have any issue actually playing the game, though there are some oddities, like when you dodge, it drops frames. And I actually at first thought this might have been an intentional design choice, that when you roll, what would happen is it slows down to kind of give you that opportunity to counterattack. I thought maybe that was actually part of the game. So upon doing some research, it turns out that this is actually just poor optimization on the game's part. Maybe that can be fixed in a patch or something. I don't actually know. Just, it's a little bit of one of those odd glitches. I don't think it breaks the game, but I don't think it's like such a good thing either.
There is a major gameplay issue in this game, especially when it comes down to its roguelike elements.
The enemy scale. We could talk about the enemy variety and that there's a little bit of a lack of variety, as if you go different paths through the game, you're gonna start to see the same enemies as you would. That's fine. I understand that it's a smaller studio. They probably couldn't design as many enemies. A few more would have been nice, but that's not where I come to the issue. The problem is that all the enemies scale. So if you look at Dead Cells, what happens is you go through the first stage of the game and you have certain enemies that have a certain stat and base, right? As you scale up, those same enemies will continue to appear in the game, but those enemies will be at the same power in the 5th stage of the game as they are in the first stage of the game. So how is it that you're able to see your progression, and as your character gets stronger, you're able to take out the original enemies that might have taken you a little bit of struggle, and you could one-shot them. You could take them out easily. They're not a threat to you anymore. They're basically a walking vending machine of currency. In Tyrant's Realm, every time you go through a stage, the enemy characters level up. Why is this a problem? Because you never feel like you're actually progressing. You always maintain the same relative power scale as you would have in the first stage. The same enemies from stage 1 pose the same amount of threat as they do at the end of the game, which is a problem because you can't see progression. In roguelike game, progression is important. And I just want to take another look at Dead Cells as a comparison. In Tyrant's Realm, whatever weapon you find that you like, you stick with it for the entirety of the run. So if you find, let's say, the brass knuckles, and that's your favorite item, there's no point in ever replacing it because it purely scales in runes. With Dead Cells, not only is there the option of scaling through your pages of power and upgrading that way, but you could actually find higher level versions of the same item on the map. So if the base one does 20 damage, you could find a level 5 one that's going to increase the damage, and it's going to have more bonus effects to go with it. This is just another way in which Tyrant's Realm kind of takes the idea from Dead Cells, but doesn't quite get what makes the idea work and why it's such a good idea. And it would be a really easy fix by adding weapon levels into the game. Plus, adding weapon levels into the game would help alleviate the feeling that Tyrant's Realm gives you that you do not scale well into the game. I just want to take a step back for a second. Instead of talking about the gameplay, I'd like to talk about the aesthetics of the game. The game goes with a very PS1 style look. if you turn on the pixel graphics setting. And honestly, when you go back and forth between the pixel setting and the more modern setting, I actually love the way the pixel PS1 version looks. I think this is the aesthetic that the game was going for. And with that in mind, I feel that you are doing a disservice to the game if you don't give it a try in this manner. However, I just want to iterate and I want to specify that if you do play with the more modern looking graphics, it's still quite a nice looking game. At the cost of the game and the style, I actually quite like it, even just from a stylistic point of view. You definitely have your different biomes, you have different maps, they all look different from one another. It's visually interesting everywhere you go. So from that point of view, I think this game does an excellent job. I also mentioned the lack of enemy variety, and you'll start to see everything as the game goes on. I actually don't think that's its own issue, but I also would like to see more enemies on the screen at the same time. Each room typically had 1 to 2 enemies, and in Elden Ring, you could come into circumstances where you have 5, 6, 7 different enemies after you at the same time, and you have to get through the combat. Dead Cells, you could have lots of enemies in the room. If you're gonna go further, you could look at Hades. Also, you do room by room, but each one will have multiple enemies unless it's maybe a mini boss. I've also noticed that the strategy felt very similar. No matter what the enemy was, you could almost always roll, attack, and just basically kite every enemy to death. That probably works too within a Souls-like, but I don't think quite to the same extent. Progression was a little slow. I mean, if you look at the best comparison is Dead Cells. You could get a lot more cells relative to coins in Tyrant. You don't unlock a ton. I kind of feel like in Dead Cells, you could probably unlock something permanent every run if you're making it far enough into the run. I don't know if this is the case with Tyrant's Realm. Maybe if you're making it far enough as it compared to Dead Cells, but I think early on in Dead Cells, a lot of the items cost less, so you could start to unlock things quite quickly. Another odd thing about the game, you could upgrade your health, you could upgrade your armor, you could upgrade your weapons, sort of. But here's the thing, you can't upgrade your stamina. If you look at Elden Ring and the way that stats work in the game, you could upgrade your health, your damage, or you could upgrade your stamina so that you could do stuff like attack or dodge roll or sprint more frequently. In Tyrant's Realm, you upgrade your health through the same system as you would in Dead Cells, but you have no way of increasing the frequency in which you could dodge roll. Maybe it's unnecessary given the lack of enemies and all in the game, or the lack of enemies on screen at the same time. But I just want to take a second to go to my original question. Shockingly, with all of the issues I've had with the game and everything I've mentioned in the video, I actually still think you should play the game if you're interested in Souls-like games or roguelike games that have a Souls-like combat system. Like I said, the game is actually fun from a gameplay perspective. I just wish that they would update it. But because the game says it's a full launch title and not something like an early access, I wonder if it will actually get the support that it would need in the long term. Fun game. It's definitely a great distraction between now and Elden Ring Nightreign. Not one of the greats, but definitely a game worth playing.